And now if you're like, well, now God's not omnipotent, God's like, screw you. I'll just destroy the stone if I want. Like you asked, can I create a stone so big that you can't lift it? Well, I did. I just did it. Now what? So like, no problem. No problem.
Greetings from Serbia and welcome to another episode of the NT podcast. My name is Nemanja Jurišić and today we are honored to have Dr. Ryan Mullins with us, one of the leading philosophers of religion and theologians of our time. So welcome.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for coming. This is our third time, I believe. So Dr. Mullins is widely known for his research on the attributes of God and the coherence of theism, and his work continues to inspire deep reflection on questions of God and time, free will, problem of evil, God and emotions, and many more. So in this episode, we will be exploring whether theism is truly coherent and are there internal contradictions in the concept of God. Doesn't that prove that God actually can't exist, etc.? So, how to properly understand God's omnipotence, omniscience, omnipresence, and goodness, and which philosophical challenges spark the most debate between theists and atheists? So, my first question, Dr. Mullins, at the beginning, let's start with the argument for God's existence to check whether Kalam argument is sound and consistent, whether the very idea of God's existence is coherent. Then we will dive into some attributes of God. So here is a longer quote from Timothy O'Connor. He says, quote, William Lane Craig argued that the universe is having a beginning both has empirical support in Big Bang cosmology and is one of the proper conclusions to draw from paradoxes stemming from the hypothesis that there is an actual realized infinite series. Both bases have been challenged. There are theoretical physical models that posit that our universe, with its origin in the Big Bang, is itself the result of antecedent causes that stretch back without a beginning. These models are speculative at present, but they suggest that the Big Bang singularity may not be the last word on our world's physical origin. And many philosophers and scientists contend that the paradoxes associated with an actualized infinity only illustrate that our intuitive reasoning is unreliable when it comes to infinity, whose mathematical foundations were clarified only in the 19th century. So what is your comment?
Hmm. It's definitely up for debate about whether or not Big Bang cosmology is going to be the final word on like the history of the universe. But at the moment, it's the best model we have, and we're working with it. So, it's some evidence for the beginning of the universe at the moment. If science decides to change its mind and go somewhere else, it's possible because science changes its mind often if you are familiar with the history of science. But that's not the only reason to affirm the conclusion that the universe has an absolute beginning. So that's why Craig gives these arguments about the infinity of the past. Like you can't have an infinity. The best reason for this, in my opinion, is the fact that you cannot reach infinity through successive addition. So if I dare you to start counting now, like starting with one, and I'm like, I dare you, you can't reach infinity. Well, I'm going to win because you could just keep counting and counting, and you're never going to reach infinity. And inferences you could make is, well, okay, let's press pause in the universe at this moment and count backwards and be like, well, how many days were before this one? Well, there was one, then there was the two, and then there was three, and you keep going and going and going. You're never going to reach infinity because you cannot, it's just impossible to reach infinity through succession. And since we're living in constantly moving at it, you can infer that it couldn't have been an actual infinite, and so it'd have to be a finite past. So that's like another justification for the Kalam argument that the universe had a beginning is usually something like this.
Right, but would you say that's metaphysically impossible, or is it logically impossible to have infinite, actual infinite?
I don't draw too tight of a distinction between logical and metaphysical impossibilities. I know what people are saying when they make these kind of claims, because look, logical contradictions where you've got A and not A. Physical contradictions of those. In my opinion, this is just, I don't know, it's kind of silly to me. Because not all contradictions wear themselves on their sleeves. Sometimes it's really easy to spot the contradiction, sometimes it's not. So, it's the idea of like a married bachelor. That one's right there on the surface because you're like, well, what it means to be married is you're not a bachelor. So you're like, oh, right. Whereas, what about a square circle? Well, that one, you got to think about it for a second. You're like, well, squares have sides, circles don't. Okay. And so what you're doing in each case is you're thinking about the basic like concept or the essence of the things involved. And that's what a metaphysical contradiction is supposed to be is like, well, you look at the essence of things involved, and therefore you're able to derive some kind of contradiction. So this distinction between logical and metaphysical, I know what people mean. I just don't think it's really that tight or interesting. So when I say that in like you can't reach infinity through successive addition, you could take it as a logical or metaphysical impossibility, but I take it as just the essence of infinity is supposed to be such that you just cannot reach it through successive addition.
Right, that's interesting, but let's grant first stage of the Kalam argument. What
Mhm.
would then be, according to conceptual analysis, the cause of the universe, according to your opinion?
Right, because yeah, the first stage of the Kalam, it just gets you to the universe like began to exist, and therefore it has a cause. And so you're like, okay, well, what caused it? Well, maybe there was another universe, but then you just kind of run like the same sort of like arguments again. And another option could be, well, maybe like the numbers, just like the number two brought the universe into existence. There are a small number of people who take that seriously, and I'm like, I don't know about you, but I've never found the number two like causing things. Like the number two never broke into my house and anything like that. You know, it's usually like behaves quite well by doing nothing. Um, Other options are so Graham Oppie and Quentin Smith and some others. They've got this claim that maybe there's an initial stage of physical reality. So there is like a first moment. It never began to exist, but it does cease to exist. So you got all the stuff about the Kalam, there being an absolute, like a finite past. And so you get to this initial stage of reality, this first moment. And Oppie's analysis is there's this physical thing that's got these indeterminate properties. It has just indeterministically causal properties. So it just kind of goes bang for no reason whatsoever. And I'm like, whoa, that's an option. It's something definitely worth considering. I don't think it satisfies a lot of everything that we will look for in an open explanation of reality. Like I don't think it really satisfies the principle of sufficient reason in the way that Oppie thinks it does. Because the principle sufficient reason is supposed to get me back to a necessarily existent being, and this initial physical stage of reality doesn't necessarily exist, like because it ceases to exist, and you're not doing a very good job at being necessarily existent if you cease to exist. So, and then it also, I don't, it is very mysterious what this initial state is. So you want to ask a lot of questions, like really, is it really the sort of thing that could be an ultimate explanation? I just think it's missing too many details to really be a serious contender. That's my biggest complaint against it. Um, and then you've got a God hypothesis where there's this necessarily existent eternal being that's got like omniscience, omnipotence, and so forth, and has free will. And that seems like a good contender. The reason it seems like a good contender to me is because when you're looking for ultimate explanations of reality, you have to ask the following question. Is this the sort of thing that could actually be an ultimate explanation of reality? Like, does it, what, given its kind of properties and its features, does it have anything that's just left unexplained? Does it leave anything that's kind of brute or mysterious? Could it really pull off explaining the rest of the world? An omnipotent, eternal, necessarily existent being seems like a contender. You've got some content here that you can work with. You can understand it, and you can understand how it's going to explain the rest of reality. It wants to create some stuff, so it does. Okay, cool. Like you've got some sort of story intelligible that doesn't have problems right from the start, like the other views do.
Amazing. But Professor Mullins, how do you jump from those things to omnipotence, omnipresence, and other things, because the only thing we see in those arguments, such as Kalam, is that there is some maybe eternal being without beginning, and maybe with free will, and that's it. So how we jump from that to perfect being theism, because also we can explain
Mhm.
Kalam argument in the polytheism, limited theism. So yeah.
Right. Yeah. So those are all other possible contenders for ultimate explanations of reality. So my view on natural theology is you come up with a couple different hypotheses, a few different hypotheses to consider and see do they satisfy several principles. And then do they fit with, are there reasons to think it's true? The Kalam is just one argument for thinking that a couple different, maybe two or three different hypotheses are true. So it's consistent with some kind of limited being that it's not an omnipotent being, but it's a being that's like powerful enough to, cause a universe to exist. With by itself, it gets you to like God. And that's fine with me because I think I've got other reasons for why a God hypothesis is a better ultimate explanation of reality than like a limited being hypothesis. And that has to do with what's called the like a principle of no arbitrary limits. Because when you're coming up with an ultimate explanation, you don't want a bunch of arbitrary limits on something because those are brutes, those are unexplainable mysteries. So when you're looking at like this being, like say like Philip Goff's like a conception of God, where it's like he's got some power, he knows some stuff, it doesn't really have a lot of unity. We might have some questions about like the unity of consciousness, how you're going to get that. You got a lot of questions about a lot of things, like why is it so limited in power? Why is it so like limited in unity? Why is it so limited? You start asking like why, and there's no answer, and you're like, oh, this doesn't sound like an ultimate explanation anymore. Whereas when you're like, look at a being that's like it's perfect. And you're like, well, why is it well, that's just what perfection is. Like it has to be perfect. Like, why is it omnipotent? Why not more power? I'm like, you can't have more power. Why not less power? It's just omnipotent. So like these seem like natural stopping points in terms of telling a story of the world.
Yes, it makes sense. So, can you give us why you think that the cause of the universe have a free will? What is the argument for that?
Hmm. So when I'm coming up with my God hypothesis, I do engage in a couple different kinds of like methods to develop the hypothesis. One of which is the method of perfect being theology. You sit down and you start thinking, what kind of properties or attributes would a perfect being have to have? And then you kind of fill in some details there. And so the standard move is to go, well, a good starting point is to look for properties or attributes that are better to have than not have. Power, that's better to have than not have. Okay, if it's better to have than not have, well, then that's like gonna make something like greater. And if we're trying to figure out like which being is perfect or the greatest, you want to make sure it's got all the properties that make something great. And so you just kind of go like that. Free will, is it better to have free will than not? I think so. Why? Well, if you think that power is better to have than not have, free will is a kind of power to have. And it's a good kind of power to have because it's the ability to act on the basis of reasons in order to reason about things and bring about efficaciously bring about states of affairs that you want to bring about. Like that's a good power to have that makes something greater. And so when you're thinking about, well, is that a great making property, something that a like a perfect being, the greatest being will have? Yeah, that seems like a really good one. So that's one reason you might go with that. There's others you could give, but like I'll just stop there.
All right. Would you say, like Dr. Craig, that the cause of the universe should be immaterial, spaceless, and other things imaginally powerful? Because I think Joe Schmidt said you don't need to be so powerful because you just need to maybe move some domino at the beginning. So yeah, maybe.
Yeah. Yeah, so that goes back to this principle I mentioned earlier of no arbitrary limits. So the Kalam again is perfectly consistent with the limited deity. Like it really is. So you bring up principles at play to figure out your what the ultimate explanation of reality is. So the Kalam by itself, I don't think is going to get you. a God hypothesis. It gives evidence for a God hypothesis, but could give evidence for some lesser being. So that's when you have to engage in some different kind of arguments, like the ones we just discussed. Now, when it comes to other properties, though, so Craig wants it to not just be like a being with free will. It's like, omnipotent or whatever. It also needs to be timeless and spaceless. This is, um, I don't think this follows from any of the arguments he's run. And he, in several different publications, doesn't necessarily timeless. He has independent reasons for thinking that time and space are created. Uh, some of those have to do with Big Bang cosmology. Some of those have to do with biblical arguments. So he's got a network of arguments he'll bring to the table to try to justify the claim that the best hypothesis is a being that's timeless or spaceless. But the Kalam by itself is not going to get you that. Because what the Kalam by itself gets you is there's like a first moment that never began to exist. Is that moment timeless? Is it temporal? I think it's temporal. Al-Baghdadi in the Middle Ages thought it was temporal. Dean Zimmerman, he's like, yeah, it's temporal. Why not? Richard Swinburne's like, yes, of course. Whereas Craig's like, no. And I'm like, well, we got to bring in some other arguments to adjudicate the differences of opinions here.
Yeah, but wouldn't you say that if God is spaceless and timeless, he's more perfect because he's not limited to time and space? So maybe that's the case.
Mhm. I don't know what it means to be limited by time. Because when you're looking at different theories on the nature of time, none of them have it the case where like time is like God's mom, it's telling him what to do. So like I just don't know what it means to be limited by time. Uh, Especially if you go with something like Isaac Newton or Samuel Clarke's view, where time is a divine attribute. It's an essential attribute of God. If space and time are essential divine attributes, then there's no meaningful sense in which you could say God is limited by time and space. It would be like saying God's limited by his omnipotence. He's limited by his necessary existence, and you just insert any essential attribute God has. So the accusation of limitation becomes coherent quickly if this is the view that's under consideration.
Okay, so let's move to some next questions about
Mhm.
monotheism. What are the philosophical justifications for the preference of monotheism over polytheism?
hmm So when you're looking at again, like different concepts and different stories of ultimate explanations of reality. So let's start with the concepts. The concept of God is supposed to be of a perfect being, which is the single ultimate foundation of reality. And so that's a so if you've got to compare that with some kind of like polytheistic story where there's a bunch of beings, maybe they're all equally perfect, maybe they're not equally perfect. I don't know. You're gonna have to tell a story there. Um, but a monotheistic story is a simpler hypothesis. When you are weighing different theories, there's a couple different things you want to look for. Explanatory power is very, very important. Can it explain all the phenomena that it's meant to explain? And say in a position where monotheism and polytheism both explain phenomena, the existence of the universe. Okay, cool. Well, now what do we do? Well, now you look for other theoretical virtues like simplicity. Is it a simpler hypothesis? Does it posit more entities than it needs to in order to explain all of the phenomena? Well, monotheism is a simpler hypothesis and it can explain all the phenomena without having to posit other divine beings. And so it's a simpler hypothesis than polytheism, so it's more likely to be true.
Can you just repeat the last sentence because of internet connection? You said it's simpler, and then
Oh, yes. So to repeat it, the claim is when you're looking at when you're looking at two different theories and they have equal explanatory power, you move to different theoretical virtues to decide between the two. And the simpler hypothesis is likely to be true. It doesn't mean it's like guaranteed to be true. It's just more likely to be true. Monotheism is a simpler hypothesis that can explain the existence of the universe. And so it's got the same explanatory powers as polytheism. We're granting that for the argument. But it's more simple because it doesn't posit extra entities beyond what's necessary to explain the phenomena. So it's more likely to be true.
Do we really have a equal explanatory power? Because some things in the world are designed, some are not. We see even different design, so it may look like some fight between gods and similar. So, what do you think about that?
Yeah, I know like David Hume and some others have these kind of like objections. I never felt the intuitive force of this because especially if I really get into the text of these things, there's this idea called the great chain of being that will really question all the way to the and the idea is God at the top of the chain, and then everything else on down the chain has some kind of value. And there's all these different gradations of different kinds of beings. They all have some kind of value. And one kind of hypothesis you see throughout history is the reason God creates is in order to create all the valuable things on the great chain of being. And since there's all these different kinds of variation, you need to have a and if you're going to create a universe where you can get as many things in the great chain of being as possible, you're going to have a universe that's designed in a way to produce lots of different kinds of things. So I don't see when I'm looking at all the different wide variety of things, I'm like, right, it makes sense given this monotheistic hypothesis of trying to create the great chain of being. I don't know why I need to posit different like like deities to be like, well, that one designed this part, this other one designed this part. I'm like, why would I? Why? Like, why wouldn't it just be that like one being like God was like, yeah, I need a really complex world because I'm trying to get like all the stuff on the great chain, and I need a lot of like crazy kind of things happening in all over this universe. I just don't see why one deity would not do that, whereas like I definitely need like three or four or five or six or a whole bunch of different deities. I just don't motivation for it.
Great answer, Dr. Mullins. Let's continue with some definitions. Can you define omnipotence, and then I will ask questions about that.
Mhm. So I take omnipotence to be the most power-granting set of abilities, which logically excludes all liabilities. So here's what this means. So in English, when we talk about abilities, not everything that I can call an ability is actually a power. Sometimes it's a liability or a weakness. So I have the ability to have false beliefs. Is that really an ability or is that like a weakness? Well, if I'm speaking more strictly, that's a weakness. And so you're like, okay, well, if God's really like omnipotent, he's got the most power granting set of abilities. Well, he doesn't have the ability to have false beliefs. Instead, he has the ability, the actual power to have like all false beliefs and believe and develop beliefs in the right kind of way. And you're like, okay. So he's got this like so one kind of power that I have as an omnipotent being is like maximal cognitive excellence, like the ability or power to know all of the things and to know them in the right kind of way. Let me give you one more example of this. So I have the ability to be irrational. Like I act on the basis of like bad reasons, or I just like when I'm just engaged in like reasoning processes, I just like I suck at it. Like I make bad inferences. Well, it's a weakness. It's a liability. It's not really a power. Like a real power would be like a maximal like power would be something like the ability to engage in perfect reasoning, like never make bad inferences and always act on the basis of objectively good reasons. So perfect rationality is going to be like built into, I think, like this maximal like cognitive excellency or built into this idea of like the most power granting set of abilities. That's the idea.
Is this similar like Eugene Nagasawa's definition? He says something like God possesses power, knowledge, goodness, and other attributes to the maximal degree that is mutually coherent. So he avoids all contradictions with that definition. Is it same or what?
It's consistent with what Eugen is up to. I am not committing myself to that. So what Eugen does is he says there's a distinction between an omni-God hypothesis or a maximal God hypothesis. And so an omni-God hypothesis is where like, yeah, God's got like omnipotence, omniscience, and so on and so on. A maximal God thesis, like that's a little bit weaker. It's just like whatever is the most maximal degree that's consistent with other things. I think the maximal degree stuff is interesting. It's kind of cool, but we don't know what the maximal degree is for some of these degreed properties. I'm just like, that's just omnipotence or that's just omniscience. Like that's just what we have always meant. So yeah, I don't really yeah, it's got a lot of benefits that pays off for some of Nagasawa's arguments. I just don't feel the pull to go in that direction.
All right. So, can you give some arguments even to believe in omnipotence? Because isn't it more logical to believe in a being with limited power that we previously mentioned? Because we solve with this logical problem of evil, omniparadoxes, everything. So, it's maybe more simple explanation, right?
Hmm. Yeah, so there's a lot of people, like a lot of process theists, they'll do this kind of move. Where they'll say like, let's get rid of omnipotence, and you're like, oh, you want to get rid of Oh, that's interesting. Go on, tell me more. And then you start pushing and prodding and poking, and you look at their theories more deeply. They affirm God has maximal power, um, and the ability to like bring about all the different kinds of states of affairs. They just disagree with there being certain kinds of states of affairs that are they think are logically possible. So they're not really rejecting omnipotence. In fact, so Charles Hartshorne is a great example of someone he has a book called Omnipotence and Other Theological Mistakes. And so he takes omnipotence to be a mistake, but then when you start reading the details, he's like, "Yeah, you could call my view omnipotence. I just think there's a lot of baggage attached to that. So maybe you could call it something else." And I'm like, "So so you still think God can bring about any logically possible state of affairs? You just think certain kinds of states of affairs are not logically possible. Like God can't determine you to be free." Hartshorne's like, "Yeah, that's not possible." And I'm like, "Well, that's not changing the definition of omnipotence. You're just identifying something that's logically impossible." So, in my view, all these different attempts to deny omnipotence and say we've got a weaker God, what they really are doing is just identifying certain things that they think are impossible. And I'm like, well, omnipotence doesn't mean bringing about impossible things. So you've not really given me an alternative to omnipotence. You've just identified a few things that you think are impossible that I want to disagree with.
So, are there any actual argument that is independent, or is it derived from the assumption that God is perfect? So, okay, from that we see he must be omnipotent. So, is there any specific arguments to why to believe that?
Yeah, so the one is like the perfect being arguments that we've talked about. But here's another one. So you might not go with the method of perfect being theology. You might go with the method of creator theology. And so creator theology says, well, what kind of properties would God have in order to be the asymmetrical source of everything else? And and so Jonathan Quanvig tries to develop this. And he's like, well, it's got to be really powerful. And it's like, well, why is it just this amount of power instead of this other amount of power? And he's like, well, right, well, you don't want to have any sort of arbitrary like limits built into your analysis of like like this being that's the source of all else, because then it doesn't sound like it's going to be really the source of all else. It's going to have a lot of like mysterious, brute, unexplained things. So saying all powerful or omnipotent, well, there's no arbitrary limits there, so there's nothing to explain. And so he thinks that, like, yeah, when you're looking at just what it means to be the creator, it's got to be super powerful. But why this amount of power, that amount of omnipotence, just says, well, there you go. There's nothing to ask for. There's nothing left to explain. So it's a combination of you've got a method and then you've got a basic principle of no arbitrary limits in my ultimate explanation of reality.
All right, thank you so much. So, what do you think about
Mhm.
a view of Thomas Ford? He believes that God is omnipotent. Maybe that's a better explanation. That's similar to limited but maybe with accent to God's love. Maybe that's he would admit also that he's really really powerful, but not omnipotent. So, what do you think?
Right. So when I gave Hartshorne as an example earlier of someone who says, I swear I'm denying omnipotence, I think Tom in the category. And his book is called The Death of Omnipotence and the Birth of Omnipotence. So you might think, right, well, he's clearly rejecting omnipotence. And I'm like, okay, cool. Well, omnipotence is like this most power granting set of abilities and no liabilities. Tom, what are you like really worried about here? And he's like, yeah, no, that sounds really good. I like that. God has maximal power and all that. And I'm like, okay, so he's got maximal power. Why do you not like omnipotence? And what he does is he's looking at okay, question really different having all the power. Then the question, what does God do with that power? And a lot of theologians conflate these two things. They take omnipotence to be whatever God does with that power. So there are a lot of like Calvinists, Thomists, and other theological determinists. They'll say God's all powerful means God's the only thing that causes any stuff. He causes you have causal power, but God causes you to cause things. So God's the thing like causing all the stuff. And Tom Ward is like, well, I don't like that. That's impossible. You can't say like I've got power, but God's causing me to like cause things. Like that's insane. And I'm like, yeah, that is. And he goes through like looking at all these different views on what God does with his power that theologians conflate with omnipotence. And Tom gives arguments for against those, and I think he's right. But I think what Tom has unveiled is not a problem with omnipotence, but he's unveiled the like just like the total depravity of theologians who are constantly forcing other doctrines into the notion of omnipotence. I think that's what Tom has really uncovered. And his own like replacement is a God with maximal power, but he's like, well, it's got to be power's got to be consistent with perfect love. And so he thinks there's certain entailments from that. And I think some of those are interesting. Some of them I'm like, I don't think that follows. But I don't think it's really an alternative to omnipotence. I think he's just pointing out some really bad accounts of divine action and just rejecting those for good reasons.
Okay, amazing. So, could God reduce himself, if he is omnipotent, to being of limited power? Or could he be evil or even commit suicide? You already covered these questions with liabilities, but wouldn't you think that if he cannot, wouldn't that make him even more perfect if he can do those liabilities?
Mhm. Yeah, so you're right. I kind of spilled the beans on how this is going to go. So you have to ask yourself, the ability to cease to exist, is that really a power or is that a weakness? If your existence like it's kind of unstable, like you could cease to exist, you're really not that great, are you? Like you're really not that powerful, are you? Whereas like necessary existence, like that, like that's pretty great. Like you can't cease to exist. And so I think necessary existence is a perfection. Like it is like a property that's better to have than not have. And since that's the case, I don't see how God could have the power or the ability to cease to exist. So I take this to be just conceptually confused, and I don't think that the ability to cease to exist is actually an ability. I think it's just a weakness or a liability. Now, evil, you do the same thing with evil because like the ability to as I see it, when you commit an evil action, what you're doing is you're acting on the basis of bad reasons. You like you're acting and the ability to act on the basis of bad reasons. That's a liability. It's a weakness. God's going to be perfectly good in the sense he's always like perfectly responsive to objectively good reasons. Now, can he limit his power? Yeah, sure. Why not? Um, in fact, when you perform an action, anytime you perform an action, you are limiting the range of certain kinds of actions. Because if I perform one kind of action, well, it just kind of entails I can't do other sorts of things. So if I decide to like sit and talk to you tonight, well, okay, well now I've like ruled out a whole bunch of other things I could be doing right now. And so there's a limitation of scope of what could follow next from any action. Just a logical consequence of performing an action. When God performs an action, there's a sense in which you can be like, well, now only certain kind of things can follow afterwards. But I think God could limit himself in a more interesting way, though, for a while if he wants. He could limit the range of his power to that of a human, for example, if he had good reasons to do so. So for the sake of becoming incarnate, perhaps to undergo the human condition and enter into solidarity with humanity, like that's a possibility. Like you could limit the range of your power for a while to do that, and then to just it'd be temporary. But then you get you just start like going back to like the way things were before, like afterwards, after you've finished whatever act you wanted to do. So yeah, you could temporarily like limit himself in more interesting ways.
Yes, you mentioned the incarnation of Jesus. So is that also a contradiction because we have Jesus as a fully God, fully human? So what do you think? Is that even coherent?
I do think it's coherent. I think some ways of developing the doctrine are just obviously incoherent, and I want to avoid those, because I'd like to have coherent beliefs. So, what does it take to be a human person? Well, to be a person is to be a substance of a rational nature. Well, God's already got that, because he's perfectly rational. So, okay, cool. He's a substance of a rational nature. So, he's a person. Now, to be a human person is to be a person, like I just said, that is appropriately related to a human organism, like embodiment relationship. So it's a mind that is connected to or embodied in a physical organism that has a human genome. That's all it takes to be a human person. So God just needs to acquire a body in order to be a person, because he's already a person. In order to be a human person, he has to acquire a body. So fully God, and he's fully human.
Okay, good answer. So, how do you answer on the famous omniparadox of stones? So, there are multiple answers and tries. So, what's your?
Yeah, so there's two different answers. I'll give the standard answer, and then I'll give my own like really wacky take that I've not seen anybody else do. So the standard answer is you give an analysis of what the question is really asking, and the question is really asking: is God able to perform an action that makes himself not omnipotent? Is he able to create something that renders himself not omnipotent? And so they're like, well, you're asking, can God do something that's contradictory? Of course not. That's stupid. Next. And so that's the standard sort of story that you'll see. Michael Tooley, he's an atheist philosopher. That's how he deals with the paradox of the stone. Whereas I've been thinking about this more, and I'm like, okay, so what would it take to create a stone so big that you couldn't move it? Like the weight's not going to be a problem. Um, but what about this? What if God creates a stone that fills all possible spatial locations? Well, now God's created it's so big you can't move it, because in order to have a stone move, it needs to be able to go from one location to another. Well, if you create a stone so big that it fills all possible spatial locations, well, now God's created a stone so big that he can't move it. And now if you and then and so like, okay, cool, he did it. He created a stone so big that he can't move. And now if you're like, well, now God's not omnipotent, God's like, screw you. I'll just destroy the stone if I want. Like you asked, can I create a stone so big that you can't lift it? Well, I did. I just did it. Now what? So like, no problem. No problem.
I like that answer. All right. So, would you say at least if we define omnipotence such as God can do anything that is in the domain of logical possibilities? So, in that definition, would it be paradox of stone also contradiction or not? What do you think?
So if you give the standard story, like the Michael Tooley and Alvin Plantinga and all those types, they're going to say it's not in the domain of logical possibilities. Whereas I think I gave an answer where it is in the domain of logical possibilities, a stone that fills all spatial locations. And so it's logically possible. God could do it. Does he have good reason to do it? I don't know. But he could if he wants. So why not?
Okay, interesting. So, here is other version of paradox of the stone of OP. At least he told me this, so I don't know if he invented this theory. So he says, can God create a perfect solvent in one universe, which absolutely dissolves everything, and a perfect non-solvent in another universe, which nothing can dissolve, and then bring them together in some third universe?
Right. I would think no, you couldn't do that because you can't create states of affairs that have like some kind of internal incoherence into them. So it would be like asking like this kind of question: can God create a universe that's fully deterministic? A lot of theists will say do that. Or, um, can God create a universe where creatures have vegetarian free will? And the open theist will go, yeah, yeah, God could do that. And then the open theist says, now which universe is God gonna create? Because you can't create one where everything's fully determined and the creatures have free will. It's going to have to be one universe or the other. And so because you can't have all these inconsistencies in the system, um, I don't see the problem like with that analysis. So like, yeah, God can't bring these things together because that would be an incoherent system. So yeah, like it's not possible to do.
Right, you mentioned open theism. So, do you think that open theism have problem with omniscience because can God be omniscient in that theory?
Yes. So when you look at some of the okay, when you look at the accounts of open theism from the 1990s and early 2000s, they give a definition of omniscience that does look like it's kind of revised. Whereas if you look at like open theists from, say, the 1700s or the 1400s or the fourth century, they don't do that. And then now nobody does this anymore either. So here's what some were in the 90s. They say God is omniscient in the sense that God knows everything that's logically possible for him to know. And there are truths about the future, but it's impossible for God to know them. And you're like, so there's a bunch of stuff that God could know. He just can't know, but there's stuff that's out there that's true. And they're like, yeah, yeah, yeah. And I'm like, doesn't doesn't sound like omniscience to me. And so I'm not the first. Like I want to point this problem. Like a bunch of open theists themselves were like, yeah, actually, this doesn't make sense. This is not good. What we should say instead is there just are no facts about the future, or there are no facts about how exactly the future will unfold. So God does know all the truths and no falsehoods. He doesn't have any false beliefs. He knows all the truths. He knows all the total facts of reality. But there's just a bunch of stuff where there just aren't any facts about how exactly history will unfold. So the so I think where the debates are with open theism now is they definitely are just using the standard definition of omniscience. The debate is what exactly is there to know? Because the open theist says there's a bunch of stuff about the future, there's nothing there to know. Whereas like a Calvinist, a Molinist, or somebody else might say, no, there's a bunch of stuff about the future to know. And so that's where the debate is. So what is there to know?
Incredible. So, do you think that the Grim Reaper paradox poses a serious challenge to the attribute of the divine omniscience? Because if God is all-knowing, he would know exactly which Grim Reaper strikes first. But in the paradox, there is no first. So, what do you think?
I just think when we're playing around with different conceptions of infinity, we're playing mathematical games, and I think you play stupid games, you win stupid prizes. Like I really do. I feel like we're just playing with words. Um, because when you're looking at a lot of these accounts of infinity, they're using a bunch of different floating like different notions of infinity floating around. And I'm like, there's a massive equivocation going on here. And I'm not even certain if some of these concepts are really coherent at the end of the day. So yeah, I just think Grim Reaper paradox is just, I don't know, it's just playing with words. It's a mathematical game that doesn't apply to reality.
All right, thank you, Dr. Mullins. Does the Zermelo-Fraenkel set theory undermine God's omniscience since it does not allow the existence of a universal set?
Yeah, so this theory says that for every set, there's a power set, which means like you've got a set of like whatever you want, facts, truths, puppies, there's going to be a set for that. And then there's a set for that, the set. And so you never get a full, like complete set of like anything. There's a couple ways you could go with this. One, you could go, oh, goodness, there's no like complete set for all the truths about reality. Well, God's omniscient. He knows like all the things there are to know. But there's no set like full set of like all the things to know. Okay, cool. So you go with that kind of definition of God knows all the things that are logically possible to know. Um, I think the better strategy is one that Alvin Plantinga pointed out. A lot of people pointed out. Sam Liebens does is to say, well, this is a problem for set theory. This is not a problem for omniscience, because the mathematician's inability to figure out how to articulate a set of all things, of all truths. Well, that's a problem for the mathematicians. I'm sorry that you're sucking at this. This is not a problem for God's omniscience. This is a problem for your set theories. So there's no reason to think we should articulate divine omniscience in terms of set theory. That's the other response you could give.
All right, so let's move to next attributes. What about omnipresence? Because if God is a perfect being, maximally great or anything, he needs to be in every place, even in physical, entire universe. So we wouldn't even exist if he's present everywhere. So what do you think about it?
I think omnipresence is not an essential divine attribute Because if God does not create anything, what is he present to? Like there's nothing to be present to if you don't create anything. Omnipresence, I take to be an entailment from a few different things. Omnipresence means that God is causally sustaining a bunch of stuff in existence. So he's present everywhere in terms of his causal power, and he's present everywhere in knowledge because he knows cause and all. So that's all it means to be omnipresent, is just like you're causing everything in the universe, so you're there by power, and you know everything, so you're there by knowledge.
I agree. Thank you so much, Professor Mullins. And next about necessary beings. So would you say that God is necessary? And if yes, in what sense? Logically, metaphysically, or yeah.
Mhm. Yeah. So I think God is necessarily existent. And earlier I was grumpy about I don't think there's a meaningful distinction between logical and metaphysical. A lot of people like this is where they're like, well, if I say God does not exist, I've not derived any sort of obvious contradiction. And I'm like, yeah, not every contradiction wears itself on its sleeve. Sometimes you have to dig a little bit deeper. Like, is freedom compatible with determinism? Or, like on and on you can go. When you're looking at these claims, a lot of people want to say, well, God's necessary existence is a metaphysical necessity because it's just of the essence to God of God that he has to exist. And I'm like, well, okay, what's the difference between that and a logical? I don't know. Anyway, now so let's go with the distinction between logical and metaphysical for a second. Some people will go, there can't be any metaphysical necessities, and you can ask, why not? And any answer they give will entail making some kind of statement that is supposed to be necessarily true, but it's not logically necessary because it doesn't wear its contradiction on its sleeve. So if I make the assertion, there are no metaphysical necessities, well, that's a necessary claim, um, and it doesn't have its contradiction on its sleeve, so it doesn't fit, some of the accounts of like logical necessity. So that statement would be a metaphysical necessity, in which case then they're metaphysical necessities.
Would you agree with Dr. Craig? He would use terms like broad and strict logical possibilities. Do you think it's
Yeah,
helpful?
I think it's helpful because it helps you, at least as a student, understand what a lot of people are saying, and it helps you understand some different debates in the past over how you can like discern the necessities and whatnot. I just don't. I don't know if I really buy the distinction anymore. But I at least I but it, I know what people are saying when they talk about broadly logical necessity or strict necessity or broadly logical contradictory or strict contradictory.
Yes, okay, but I can imagine a world where God doesn't exist. So does that prove that there is no necessary being, at least for me?
Right. So it might be epistemically possible in the sense of like you can get some ideas in your head, but it doesn't mean conceivability is a guide to just discerning what's possible and what's impossible, but it's not an infallible guide. Uh, so Peter Van der Wagen, he's got some moments where I think he's actually trying to argue for like modal skepticism, but I think this is an example from Peter. He's like, can conceive of a house made entirely of cheese? And you're like, yeah, why not? I've got it in my head, and I could tell like a fairy tale about it. And he's like, yeah, but like really, like a house made of cheese, like that's just not material that's going to be able to really form into like it's going to follow. Like you're not really thinking about all of the fine grained details. And so someone could say the same thing about like, oh, you're not okay. You can imagine a universe where God doesn't exist. Okay, well, you're not thinking about the fine grained details. One of which is God. Like part of what it means to be God is to exist of metaphysical necessity. So you know, and this is where when you're looking at ontological arguments for the existence of God, one of the premises is that it's possible that God exists. And if it's possible that God exists, therefore God exists. And everyone's like, whoa, okay, I don't like that. Well, the reason that move like takes place is because when you think it's possible that God exists, well, what does it mean to be God? Well, it means to exist of metaphysical necessity or broadly logical necessity, whatever. Okay, well, there you go. If it's possible that God exists, well, then he does exist. And so the move, I think the best like objections are to try to point out, well, it's not possible that God exists. There's something incoherent about the idea of God. I think those are the That's like kind of where these debates take place, and I think so for good reason.
Right. So would you say that the ontological argument is sound, or it just shows that either God must exist in every world, or it can't exist in any world? So is that the purpose of the argument, or
I mean, the purpose of the argument depends on who's offering it and what their goal is. Because like there's different versions of the argument throughout history, and if some people have got different goals in mind for what they're wanting to do. But like like if you take like a standard like modal ontological argument, it's usually trying to show that if it's possible that God exists, then God exists. And you fill in some of the details of the modal system you're working with to get those entailments, and then you got to defend the coherence of the idea of God. So yeah, so I think it is trying to show that like if it's possible that God exists, then God necessarily exists. Boom. Okay. Well, there you go. It's impossible for God to not exist.
okay? Let's move to next
Hmm?
attribute. Does God have the attribute of worship worthiness? Just quick question. Sorry about that.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I don't. I'm still trying to figure out exactly how this works. Actually, I just supervised a master's thesis on this, and there's different accounts of what it means to be worship worthy. Is this like a fundamental attribute of God? Is it something that's kind of like derivative from like God just having all the great making properties, or is it like a derivative from an action that God performs? And I'm like, oh gosh, I don't know. I don't know which theory to go with. So my answer at the moment is I think God's worthy of worship, but why exactly? I don't know. I don't know because there's a bunch of theories and I don't know how to sort them out.
Yes, but if we say God demands beings to worship Him, a little harder definition, would you say that's too much, or?
I don't think so. Because it's a very common claim. So John Calvin has this statement of saying you should only worship God if you are certain he's the fountain of all goodness. Which I'm like, okay, that makes sense to me. Because if God is like this, is if it's like some sort of evil being, then I'm like, well, that's not a being that I can worship. That's a being I can fear, I can be terrified of, and I might try to be obedient towards it, but like, I'm not going to worship it. So I definitely need to think it's a good being, and in a good being, if a good being commands me to worship it, I would hope that I would think it has good reasons for that being the case. I just don't know how to spell them all out because there's different theories of worship worthiness, and I don't know which one.
Do you think that if some people experience some great evils and misery, if they feel they don't need to worship God, is that okay for them? What do you think?
I I I do think that's okay because I think that God is big enough to understand why people are upset. When you look at the story of Job, like this is a great example of someone who's very angry at God, and you could go, yeah, he's got very good reasons to be angry at God, and and what you have is Job's three friends. They tell like Job, now the reason you're suffering right now is you did something wrong. You did something wrong, and Job keeps saying, no, I did nothing wrong. Like the situation sucks. Like something unjust has happened. Like where is God? I want God to come down and judge me. And God comes and he says, only Job has spoken rightly of me. So he doesn't correct Job. He does have some moments where he's like, Job, make sure you check yourself. Remember, I'm the creator of the universe, remember who you are. But he never says like you're speaking like just completely out of line. So what I take away from stories like Job and other passages in the Bible is that this is a God who is extremely patient. God understands the situation you're going through. He understands your complaints, and he understands why a lot of your complaints are, quite legitimate. Because God has asked us to undergo this project of creation, and it's not always pleasant, and God knows it. And so that requires God to be patient with us in the process. And so I do think that yeah, it's understandable why people who are suffering they don't want to worship God, and God's like, I understand. I'll patiently wait.
Fascinating, Professor Mullins. So, when we speak on coherence of theism, how not to mention at least a little about Trinity? So, which model of Trinity you hold? Just a
Mhm.
quick question. Is there a contradiction on your view?
So I think the social, like some kind of social theory of the Trinity is the way to go. So you've got to say there's three minds, they each have their own first person perspective and they have their own will. Like I think you got to say that. Otherwise, I don't know what you mean when you say there's three persons.
But would you say Father is God, Jesus is God, Spirit is God, and there is one God? Or would you say Father is divine? Or how would you?
Right. Yeah, the setup of the logical problem of the Trinity makes no sense to me. It seems like it's based on the Athanasian Creed, which we don't know who wrote it. And so I'm like, why are you listening to this creed that has no authority? We don't know who wrote it. Like, and that seems incoherent. So yeah, I think that Christians, if they want to have a consistent view of the Trinity, when they say there's one God, God refers to the three persons. So it'd be weird to say the Father is God, the Son is God, and you're like, no, no, no. God refers to the three persons. So all the persons are fully divine in the sense that they've got all the attributes to be divine, but God refers to the three persons.
Thank you, Dr. Mullins. And now, this is our last section of
Mhm,
interview about free will. So, how would you define that term, and what are the arguments in favor of its existence?
mhm. So free will, I take to be you've got this power or this ability to act on the basis of reasons to bring about some kind of goal. So free will is goal oriented, and its motives are reasons. There might be you hope they're good reasons. You might suck at it. And I now a lot of people want to add a few other details. So one other condition they might add is you've got the ability to do otherwise, at least sometimes. I think that's right. I don't know if you always need to put that into there because if I'm acting on the basis of reasons, there are a lot of times where I might have reasons to do A or not A or B or C. I've got like a bunch of different reasons, and I just got to pick something. Whereas there might be other times where there's only like one obvious option. Like the reasons just completely weigh in favor of this one option. So I think sometimes you've got options, sometimes you don't. That's life. But free will primarily is about the ability to act on the basis of reasons to achieve some kind of goal. Why do I think that we have that? It just seems like that's what we do every single day. Like we're just constantly making choices, and we're engaged in reason about those choices. Sometimes we're just recognizing the reasons. We don't have to like deliberate. We just see it. We just do it all the time. It's part of our everyday experience. So I take that to be like a just common sense that we have free will.
Okay, so why do you think even that it is good to have free will? Because if God exists and we have moral free will, isn't it better that we don't have it? Because if we don't have it, we don't have evil in the world. So we don't have free will to jump to the moon. God didn't give us permission to do those things and many other. So how would you answer?
Yeah, so the longer answer is in my book, Eternal in Love, a little book about a big God. The short answer is this. I think one of God's reasons to create this universe, just one, not the only one, but one of God's reasons to create this universe is to enter into friendship with humanity. And when you start thinking about what is required for friendship to be possible, there's at least two different things. There's more, but there's at least two. One is you need to be the kind of person God could call a friend. Like if you're just like a garbage person, like you're a horrible person, like that, God's not, you don't want to be friends with you. So you need to have the ability to develop your own moral character. And if God just it gives you that moral character from the start, well, then the relationship's not going to be a genuine relationship. It's going to be like fully coerced, fully determined. There's nothing genuine about it. So the two different conditions I built in there are the ability to develop a moral character, so you could become the kind of person God could call a friend, and then also the moral character has to be genuinely developed. It can't be forced. Otherwise, the relationship is forced, and it's not a genuine friendship.
Okay, so you reminded me on things that you talked on various places about final judgment. There are many theories: annihilationism, universalism, and other. So eternal hell. So is that coherent? Is there any theory that is coherent? Because if God destroys people at the end, it seems like there is no free will or something like that. If he saves everyone, also we have tension. So can you explain this?
I don't know. Um, I really don't know. I've written a couple papers, or a few, or I've written like I think maybe three papers trying to develop different ways of assessing the theories on hell. Um, and the arguments I give seem they're based on love being this criteria, and on the ultimate defeat of evil. These are the two criteria used to judge the different theories of hell. And I argue that annihilation is the worst view because it violates any notion of love. But now I'm thinking, well, is love and ultimate defeat of evil are those the only criteria? Because what if you become an unlovable being? Uh, like like some of the places I've lived in this on Earth are good. Some of the places I've lived are really horrible. And when I start reflecting on the horrible people there, I'm like, these people, oh my gosh, I can really imagine them just being rebellious forever and just refusing to accept God's love. And I'm like, they become unlovable. They become awful. And would God be justified in annihilating them from existence? Because there's no point in keeping them going anymore. My answer now is I don't know. Like, I don't think my objections to it are as good as I used to think. So I don't know.
Okay, yeah, we don't know, but at least we say it's a coherent idea with final judgment. There is no any contradiction, at least, or no.
Uh, my older papers point out a contradiction. But my belief at the moment is I think I made a mistake somewhere in the argument. I don't know exactly where, but I think I made a mistake somewhere in the argument. And I guess the mistake I made was thinking that like you are just automatically lovable just by simply existing. Whereas I think that's a baseline for God to have reason to love you, but the moral character you develop could give God reasons to not love you. Um, and I don't think my earlier arguments take that into consideration sufficiently. So it might be coherent.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Mullins. Now, does God have an infallible, comprehensive foreknowledge? In other words, if God is perfect, does he know exactly what will happen before it happens? And is it impossible for him to be wrong about it?
I don't know. I think so. I think like God has exhaustive foreknowledge, but there are problems for the view. Um, the idea that God could have exhaustive foreknowledge, I can come up with some different theories for how that is coherent, at least on that level. Um, but the problems pop up with, is it consistent with human freedom? And that's where I'm like, I think so, but I don't know. So that's where the problem is for me, is I don't know if it's consistent with human free will. But yeah, if God wants to create like, here's one way that like God could know the future. So a lot of Calvinists and determinists still say this, like God creates a universe that's fully determined from the start. God just like you could there's different ways you could get the determinism, but God creates a fully deterministic universe. So God knows exactly how the future is going to unfold because He's determined exactly how it's going to unfold. You're like, there you go, exhaustive foreknowledge. Molinism thinks it can give you that and give you the libertarian freedom, but there's like a couple issues that I think I can answer and some others I don't know if I can answer. Um, so that's where I have to leave it as I don't know.
Okay, we're honest. So, what do you think on Heisenberg uncertainty principle? Does that prove free will? And does God play dice? Since every time we look at an electron, it moves and there is uncertainty regarding its position. Michio Kaku comments on this, stating it means, in some sense, we do have some kind of free will. No one can determine your future events given your past history. There is always the wild card. There is always the possibility of uncertainty in whatever we do.
Mhm. Yeah. Okay. So there's different ways you can interpret the uncertainty principle. Is it an epistemic uncertainty or is it an ontic uncertainty? The kind that sounds like this the guy you quoted, he wants an ontic uncertainty. And so there's a lot of people who think that if I got ontic uncertainty, like there's just this indeterminism just built into the very fabric of reality. Well, therefore I get free will. The answer is no, no, you don't, because you need more. Because if everything's just utterly random, okay, well, can you predict what's going to happen next? Is it fully determined what's going to? No. Is it going to be random what happens next? Randomness is not freedom. Freedom is I've got the power to act on the basis of reasons to bring about some kind of goal. Am I fully determined to do that? Well, no, I do need some kind of indeterminacy, but I can't be just pure randomness. Because if I'm just acting on the basis of pure randomness, like that's I don't it's not free will. There's no reasons, there's no rationality, there's no goal orientation. So I need more things than just uncertainty.
Yes, beautiful answer. I didn't notice those details, so thank you so
Mm-hmm.
much. I have just two quotes and we'll finish this interview.
Mm-hmm.
From Lawrence Krauss, he says, I don't think there's such a thing as a free will. Everything I know about the world tells me there isn't. I just think we act, but the world behaves as if there's free will. And so it doesn't make much difference. It's like the particles in a room. We can discuss them statistically, and they behave as if they can do things they are not being forced to do. It's just statistics, and we behave as if we have free will because we live in a very complex world where there are so many factors influencing any of our decisions that you can't trace free will down to its source. So the difference in a world where we act as if we have free will, or it looks like we have free will, and we really do, in my mind, is so minimal that it's a question for philosophers to worry about, but not for me.
Yeah. Yeah. There so there's this problem that you see in physics sometimes, like it's called like this question of like superdeterminism, which is you would never know if you were living in a fully deterministic universe where you don't have any free will. The phenomenology of it would just be exactly the same. And I'm like, yeah, sure, okay, cool. The same thing goes for like, am I living in a matrix? I'm like, yeah, I wouldn't know. Like, the phenomenology is the same. Am I like just like living in like a world where it's just me and an evil demon and he's just like making me think all this stuff? And I'm like, yeah, these are all, I guess it's all like cool, fun thought experiments. It's possible. But just because you came up with a cool, fun thought experiment doesn't give me a reason to like take it seriously. The phenomenology of our everyday experience is just common sense that we've got free will. And you've got some cool, interesting mathematical models where it's like everything's determined. We also have some cool, interesting mathematical models where everything's not determined. You came up with a mathematical model that where I don't have free will. Well, good for you. Why should I think that's the right model of the world? Is the question I think to ask.
Amazing. Okay, this is the last statement from
Mm-hmm.
Alex O'Connor. This is longer. Sorry for reading
Mm-hmm.
this, but I think it's a strong argument, or at least it gives you a pause. Quote: The argument against free will, in my view, can be built from a law of logic. The proposition that P must either be true or false, and it can be both or neither. We can simply ask a question about any kind of mental activity. Is it determined or is it not? That is it determined by anything else, or is it completely undetermined by anything? If it's undetermined by anything, then it's random. And by definition, you're not in control of that which is random. If it's determined by something, then it's either determined by something further inside your mind or determined by something external to your brain. If it's determined by something external to yourself, then clearly you're not in ultimate control of that action. If it's something inside of yourself, then all you do is push the problem back and you can ask a question again. Is that thing determined or is it indeterminate? Either way, you're completely out of control. If you say that it terminates in something like a soul, as some people like to do in religious philosophy, we have the benefit of introducing a soul, but that doesn't solve anything. It's not a matter of having to explain the mechanism by which the soul brings about actions. That may well be a mystery, but if it's the case that whatever is doing that is either determined or not, and if it's not, it's random and therefore out of your control. And if it is, it ultimately terminates in something outside of yourself or something random, both of which are out of your control. free will cannot exist. Okay, sorry for a
Mhm.
longer quote, but
That's
yeah.
right. Yeah, no, this is one of these cases where I think Alex needs to read some more literature before he starts talking about different topics. Like he does this a fair number of times, in my opinion. So in this case, he's conflating a few different issues and overlooking a very important one. So one of the things he's kind of conflating, and there's this thing that's called like the problem of like the dwindling agent. Like you can't find the agent, which I think is based on a ridiculous understanding of causation, and I'll explain that in a second. Um, the other issue that's completely missing is this distinction between there's this thing called the moment of action or the moment of decision. These are two different things. In the moment of decision, like you're like in a state of like, do I do that or do I do that at the next moment? I've not acted. Am I determined to do either? Well, I'm not determined by anything external. I'm the one who's supposed to do the action. I'm the one who like brings about the action. I'm the thing that does the determining. That's what the agent is supposed to be doing. And I don't think there's anything mysterious about this. So he's lost the distinction between the moment of decision, like where you're deliberating, and the moment of the action. Uh, so the dwindling agent. This has to do with because a lot of these discussions they focus on event causation, and so they're like, well, events cause other events, and if you say that you're an agent that brings about an event, they're like, well, what's the agent? You know, like the agent just must be an event, and they keep bringing events back in and this or that, and they're like, I can't find the agent because it's just all events all the way down, and I'm like, hang on a second, give me a standard textbook definition of what an event is. An event is a substance having a property at a time. Well, an agent is a substance. It's got some properties at a different time at a time, the moment of deliberation. Uh, wow, I just found the agent. It wasn't that hard. Maybe like, focus on better definitions. Like so this is a problem in the free will literature about this dwindling agent problem where they just forgot what an event is. So that's not a problem for Alex. It's a problem for a lot of free will literature.
Amazing answer. So, Dr. Mullins, would you mind if I ask you a last question about
Mhm.
the simplicity of explanation of the
Mm.
reality? Because it's often put in debates between theists and atheists. So, Swinburne would say the God hypothesis is the simplest hypothesis, and naturalists such as OP would say that naturalism is ontologically cheaper. It explains everything as
Mm.
theism, but without unnecessary parts such as God and other things. Also, if we bring Christian theology specifically, we have angels and demons, other things, so it's complicated. So,
Mm.
how would you evaluate simplicity as a criteria?
Yeah, so notice in the Oppie quote that you gave, unnecessary posits. So you don't want to posit more than you need to explain the phenomena. And so Oppie thinks that naturalism can explain all the phenomena, and that's why it's unnecessary to posit God. So it's not just that it's a simpler hypothesis, it's that it's got all the explanatory power. And then if the theist is like, well, I've got all the explanatory power too, and Oppie's like, well, I can explain everything without positing God. So it's the simplicity of what's supposed to be breaking the two. I think that Oppie's view doesn't really have that much explanatory power. I think what we talked about like much earlier on in this interview, I think there's a lot of mysterious stuff going on in this initial state of reality. That's this physical thing. What exact properties does it have? I don't know. Oppie doesn't tell you. It just says it's got this indeterministic causation. That's that. And I'm like, it's a lot of mystery, a lot of brute stuff going on here. Can it actually explain all the phenomena? I don't know because I don't have enough content to assess that. Whereas if I look at like Swinburne gave me loads of content so I can assess, is this really a hypothesis that explains reality?
Very good. Okay, Dr. Mullins, any conclusion? Can I ask you finally, is theism coherent or not? Can you answer on that question? After all this week of
I think so. I hope so. I might be wrong because I might be wrong about lots of things, but yeah, I hope so.
All right. So, dear audience, thank you for joining us for this episode on the NT podcast. I hope this conversation with Dr. Ryan Mullins has inspired you to think more deeply about these important questions and explore them further. So, if you enjoyed the content we create, make sure to subscribe to our channel and follow us, comment and like and other things. So, we will see you soon again for more conversation on faith, philosophy, and science. And don't forget, stay faithful, but never stop asking hard questions. Goodbye.